Spider-Man Miles Morales will be written off by some folks as glorified standalone DLC for Marvel's Spider-Man, but it shouldn't. This latest title from Insomniac stands tall on its own and easily sheds the $60 DLC tagline that has been unjustly thrust upon it. With that being said, the game has a much harder time separating from the notion that it's a 1.5 version of the 2018 game instead of being a full sequel. A shorter runtime, a reused cityscape, and the return of the mostly unchanged free-flowing combat and traversal makes for an undeniable feeling that this isn't a true beefed-up sequel. But I think that's okay. Far too often, reviewers and critics get caught up in the notion that a game feeling like a 1.5 version of a previous entry automatically denotes it as being bad. It's often pointed to as evidence for a copy and paste development cycle and acts as a precursor for accusations of developer laziness. Sometimes this criticism is justified and stems from feelings of disappointment. New IPs occasionally come out and feel like they're onto something, only to squander that potential in the sequel by churning out the same untweaked experience. I get that. At the same time, occasionally, developers hit a home run at their first at-bat, and drastically changing up the player's experience in subsequent games wouldn't lead to many pleased fans. And that's the situation we find ourselves in with Miles Morales. Insomniac's Spider-Man did such a bang-up job during its release in 2018 that it wouldn't make much sense to alter things up too extremely here. And Insomniac realized this and delivered just what the player wanted. Another outing with Spider-Man with the same great combat, incredible traversal, and a classic Spider-Man tale about doing what is right, even in the face of personal consequence. Insomniac's Spider-Man started with a small-stakes story, but quickly ballooned into a grandiose superhero epic involving some of Spider-Man's most fearsome foes. Miles Morales doesn't follow this same path, as it instead elects to tell a story that's much more personal and close to home. And speaking of home, the streets of Harlem is where much of this story takes place. After being bitten by a radioactive spider in the previous game, high schooler Miles Morales becomes the next Spider-Man. He's set loose in this game as a full-time web-slinger after Peter Parker leaves for a vacation with his girlfriend. As the story unfolds, Miles is caught up in the middle of an ongoing war between an evil corporation named Roxxon and a high-tech militia force called the Underground. Roxxon is developing a renewable source of energy, but lo and behold, it causes disastrous effects to people exposed to it. This cover-up is recognized by the Underground and they attempt to stop Roxxon, but they do so through acts of terrorism. Obviously, a hero like Spider-Man can't choose to support either side due to their methodologies. But what really makes this story work as a Spider-Man tale is how Miles must juggle his personal relationships with his responsibilities of being a hero. Both his uncle and his cousin have tremendous power to go along with their own perspectives on who the true evil is. The heart of the conflict comes from his cousin Finn's involvement with the Underground. Her alter ego is the Tinkerer, the Underground's leader and weapons specialist, and while it may seem like a spoiler, it's a pretty obvious development for any fan of the webhead. The once close cousins now find themselves opposing each other despite the common enemy in Roxxon. This leads to a lot of impactful interactions between the two throughout the campaign, the best of which comes early in the game during a sequence on one of New York City's bridges. And I won't spoil how it ends, but the story concludes with an emotional sequence that was touching and heartfelt. My only gripe with the story is that we don't really ever get a proper showdown with the main antagonist associated with Roxxon. If you're coming into this title expecting the narrative to be as long as that of the original, then you're going to be disappointed. The story here is much more compact, but it benefits the game by making each mission more influential on the overarching narrative. No mission feels like filler, even the ones that are used to set up side content, and that's because even they contain moments of interaction between some of the best characters in the game. This next point comes from an outsider's perspective, but the game also does a good job of recognizing Miles' ethnicity and using that to provide an uplifting message about diversity. While everyone in the game is grateful for Spider-Man's help, the people of Harlem feel a stronger connection to Miles because both parties understand the district's diversity. So when the everyday citizens call Miles our Spider-Man, you get a small insight into how meaningful it is for them to have a hero that looks like them. Overall, I found the story of Miles Morales to be a compelling coming-of-age story, as young Miles learns to balance the relationships he holds dearest with the incredible responsibility that comes from being a superhero. Miles Morales feels most like a 1.5 version in its gameplay department because it remains virtually the same in most regards. But again, I don't consider that to be a bad thing, as 2018 Spider-Man was my runner-up for Game of the Year, and so if you enjoyed it then, you're probably going to love this experience just as much. And I knew that was going to be the case for me as soon as I took control of Miles and began web-swinging around New York City. Gliding effortlessly and quickly through the city streets immediately felt lovingly familiar and reminded me just how well these games have handled traversal. Every input is responsive and translates wonderfully to the screen as you gracefully move around this open world. This same responsiveness can be found within the game's combat, and that's what led to so many people saying that these games make you feel like Spider-Man. The ability to translate simple button inputs into grand animations that see you leaping, lunging, punching, and swinging without much exertion is what makes these games so wonderful. I have played through 2 full Insomniac Spider-Man games now, and not once have I ever felt bored while playing as Spider-Man, and that's due simply to how fluid and fast the gameplay is, and most of that is due to the wonderful animations that Insomniac crafted. Combat is where the game has seen the most amount of changes, but it remains largely the same. A well-done clone of the Batman Arkham games. Peter's super web moves from the first game have been replaced with quote-unquote venom attacks, where Miles is capable of doing supercharged strikes using built-up electric charges. These hard-hitting moves prove super useful against some of the new bulkier enemy types. The other big change is the ability to camouflage, which greatly expands your stealth abilities when compared to the previous entry. Miles can temporarily turn invisible, pick off a guard or two, and then return high up to the rafters and building tops above to avoid detection while also thinning the herd. I wish this ability had come a little bit earlier in the story, but regardless, it proves to be a useful tool when infiltrating bases. Just like its predecessor, Miles Morales opts to go for a checklist approach to side content. As you progress the main story, more and more side content will unlock all over the map. These include a multi-mission side quest, one-off side missions, challenge modes, and a handful of various collectibles. You get these small bursts of happiness when you divert your path to snag a collectible on the way to your next mission. The movement is so well done that it hardly ever feels like you wasted time. And the side missions themselves are well thought out and varied inclusions. My only knock on the side content would be the stealth challenges. I found myself failing them a lot without ever really knowing why. The game didn't give me enough feedback on why I failed. Still, the side content provides fun distractions to break up the main story, while also enhancing one of those central themes of every good Spider-Man story. That being that there's a lot to accomplish within a small amount of time, which leads to a very hectic life for Peter and Miles. One thing that I really appreciate about this game's shorter runtime is that it led those awful stealth sections with MJ and Miles from the first game to hit the cutting room floor. Nothing in this game feels like filler, and the flow is never interrupted to ensure that this feels like as seamless an experience as possible. If I ever want to revisit one of these titles in the future, it will probably be Miles Morales because of this. I can get the same great exploration, movement, and combat with a set of characters that is just as interesting and likable as the first game without having to slog through the boring bits. When it comes to presentation, Miles Morales is difficult for me to discuss as I'm reviewing it on my PlayStation 4 Pro. I was convinced that I wasn't going to get a PlayStation 5 before year's end, and I'm glad that didn't pan out like that, but at the same time, I didn't want to miss out on this game, so I ordered it early and played it on PS4. Obviously, this experience would have been better to have on the new console, but that's just not what happened for me. Instead, playing on PlayStation 4, it was very easy to notice the moments where the PlayStation 5's superior power was meant to be flexed. There's scenes with incredible amounts of particle effects, extremely detailed visuals, and even slowed down animations that would have really popped on a PlayStation 5. And while these moments still look good on a PlayStation 4 Pro, it's clear that Insomniac pushed, or was told to push, the graphical output to the max to demonstrate the quality difference between PS4 and PS5. One thing that's crazy to me is that there's these scenes where you go from inside a building directly to swinging around in outside New York. These were clearly meant to wow on the PlayStation 5 by showing off just how fast the game could load things, but the problem is, this same feat is accomplished on a PS4 Pro, so that diminishes the wow factor for me. Either way, you're still getting a beautiful game if you buy on PS4. The sound work was also very well done, and I enjoyed Miles' hero theme a lot as well. In terms of performance, this game gave me no major issues. There was only one instance when the game froze, but it quickly resolved within 5 seconds. Besides that, there was maybe a few frame rate drops here and there, but nothing that noticeable. I was pleased with the presentation and performance of this game, despite playing on inferior hardware. Perhaps the greatest strength that Miles Morales has over the original game is its sense of good pacing. The shorter narrative allows for a tighter focus that doesn't have to spend any time on introducing themes or characters that may not have a big impact on the story being told. The conflict between Miles, Finn, and Roxxon is enough to carry the simpler story, and the supporting cast does a good job at bringing flair and heart to the campaign. The gameplay is as solid as ever, with a fluid movement system that will see you never wanting to fast travel, and a combat system that feels dynamic and full of options. And even on a PlayStation 4, the game runs wonderfully and looks beautiful most of the time. Some may get caught up in calling Miles Morales a piece of glorified DLC, or a 1.5 version of the first Spider-Man game. But for me, I will stick to calling it what it really is. One of the best video games I played in 2020. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please leave a like if you enjoyed it, consider subscribing for more, follow me on Twitter at NopNapNarp, and as always, have a nice day, and take care.